The first thing Marcus Ellington noticed was that the marina manager stopped calling him "Captain" the moment the paperwork cleared. 20 seconds earlier, the older man had been smiling, shaking his hand beside the polished teak railing of the Meridian Grace while sunset burned orange across Charleston Harbor. Then a younger employee hurried down the dock holding a tablet, whispering something into the manager's ear. The smile disappeared almost instantly. The man glanced at Marcus differently after that. More carefully. Like he had just realized the 43-foot yacht wasn't leased. It was fully owned. And somewhere behind them, Marcus heard a woman quietly say his name in disbelief. Marcus? He turned toward the neighboring dock and saw Tasha standing completely still beside a white Range Rover, one manicured hand frozen around her phone. The wind moved softly through the rows of moored boats, carrying the smell of saltwater and diesel fuel across the marina. Charleston's evening crowd drifted between restaurants and rooftop bars along the harbor, but Marcus barely noticed any of it. His attention stayed on Tasha. 3 years earlier, she had walked out of a downtown mediation office wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a leather folder that held the final divorce agreement. She hadn't cried. Hadn't hesitated. She had signed every page with the detached confidence of someone closing an outdated account. And now she stood 30 feet away staring at a yacht with his company logo etched into the side in silver lettering. Ellington Maritime Logistics. Marcus watched her eyes move across the polished hull, then toward him again, trying to solve a math problem that made no sense. He gave her a small nod. Calm. Respectful. Nothing more. Didn't know you were into boats now, she said finally, though the strain beneath her voice reached him immediately. Marcus slid the signed ownership packet into a dark leather portfolio. Work expansion, he replied. Needed something client-facing. It wasn't a lie. But it also wasn't the whole truth. Tasha's gaze lingered on the marina office behind him where the manager was suddenly treating Marcus with a kind of polished caution usually reserved for old money. Marcus noticed that too. He noticed everything. André Baptiste stepped onto the dock carrying 2 paper coffee cups despite the humid heat. Registrations finalized, he said. Insurance too. Then André noticed Tasha standing nearby and immediately slowed his tone. Oh. Tasha forced a smile. Congratulations, Marcus. Guess things worked out for you after all. The sentence landed strangely. Not cruel enough to be an insult. Not warm enough to be sincere. Marcus accepted the coffee without looking away from her. Eventually, he said. The marina lights flickered on one row at a time as daylight faded across the harbor. Behind Tasha, a valet brought another luxury SUV toward the entrance circle, and Marcus caught the quick flick of her eyes toward it. Reflex. Social positioning. Charleston had always been full of that. People tracking watches, neighborhoods, memberships, names. During their marriage, Tasha had noticed every expensive thing in every room within seconds. Marcus used to think it was ambition. Toward the end, it started feeling more like hunger. Tasha stepped closer to the yacht slowly, heels tapping against the dock. How much does something like this even cost? She asked casually. Too casually. Marcus took a sip of coffee before answering. Depends who's buying. André hid a grin behind his cup. Tasha didn't smile back. Marcus saw the calculation happening behind her eyes now. The harbor breeze lifted strands of her hair while she studied the vessel's upper deck, the satellite systems, the imported wood trim. She wasn't admiring it anymore. She was inventorying it. That difference mattered. Marcus had spent years around shipping contracts and corporate negotiations. He recognized acquisition behavior when he saw it. You still living out on James Island? She asked. Sometimes. Another partial truth. Tasha frowned slightly. That answer had bothered her because it implied options she didn't know about. Before she could ask another question, her phone lit up in her hand. Marcus caught only a glimpse of the screen before she angled it away, but he saw the name Julian appear across the top. Her expression shifted almost instantly after reading the message. Sharper. More alert. I should go, she said. Yet she didn't move. Not right away. Her eyes drifted back toward the yacht again. Marcus watched her walk toward the Range Rover while the marina crowd continued flowing around them. Couples laughed beneath string lights. A bartender rolled crates across a patio nearby. Somewhere farther down the harbor, live jazz drifted faintly through the evening air. Normal Charleston Friday night. But Marcus felt something underneath it now. A pressure shift. Andre waited until Tasha's SUV disappeared beyond the marina gates before speaking again. You think that's gonna become a thing? Marcus kept his eyes on the dark water. Don't know yet. Andre lowered his voice. The divorce paperwork was airtight. Marcus nodded once. It had been airtight. Evelyn Carter had made sure of that. Separate filings. Separate timelines. Separate capital structures. Every signature clean. Every ownership trail documented. Marcus had rebuilt his entire life carefully after the divorce. Not emotionally. Structurally. That was the difference people rarely understood about him. He didn't react while everyone else was emotional. He built systems while they underestimated him. The marina manager returned carrying another set of documents Marcus had already signed once. Apologies, Mr. Ellington, the man said politely. Corporate office requested duplicate verification copies for vessels over this valuation tier. Over this valuation tier. Marcus noticed the phrase immediately. So did Andre. The manager set the papers down carefully, almost nervously. A few slips of language could tell you exactly when people realized your financial position had changed. Marcus signed the duplicate forms without comment, but one page caught his attention before he handed it back. Under emergency contact authorization, someone had highlighted a line in yellow marker. Beneficial ownership structure confirmation required. The highlighted note hadn't been there earlier. Marcus looked up. This wasn't on the original packet. The manager blinked once. Corporate added it 10 minutes ago. Why? Standard procedure for vessels under holding companies. Marcus said nothing after that. But something inside him shifted slightly. Because only a very small number of people even knew the Meridian Grace belonged to a holding company. Andre must have sensed it too. Once the manager walked away again, he lowered his voice carefully. You think somebody started digging already? Marcus looked toward the marina office windows glowing gold against the darkening harbor. Inside, two employees were speaking quietly while glancing toward the yacht. One of them quickly looked away when Marcus noticed. Maybe, Marcus said. The harbor suddenly felt different than it had an hour ago. Smaller somehow. More connected. Tasha seeing the yacht could have been coincidence. Charleston was small enough for coincidences. But the highlighted ownership notation wasn't coincidence. Neither was the sudden change in how marina staff were handling the paperwork. Marcus slid the leather portfolio under his arm and looked once more toward the empty marina entrance where Tasha's SUV had disappeared. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. He answered calmly. Silence met him first. Then a man's voice said quietly, "You should have kept the ownership structure private a little longer." The line disconnected before Marcus could answer. He stood motionless beside the yacht while the harbor lights reflected across the black water below him. And for the first time that evening, Marcus realized this was no longer just about Tasha discovering he had money. Someone already knew far more about his business than they should have. Marcus replayed the phone call 3 times in his head during the drive home. Not the words themselves. The timing. The voice had arrived less than 4 minutes after the marina manager highlighted the ownership structure notation. That meant whoever called either had access to the marina system in real time or was physically nearby watching the paperwork move. Charleston traffic crawled along East Bay Street beneath strings of restaurant lights reflecting off rain-slick pavement while Marcus drove in silence, one hand resting lightly against the wheel. His phone sat face down beside him. Unknown number. Blocked caller. He could still hear the man's tone clearly. Calm. Familiar with leverage. You should have kept the ownership structure private a little longer. Not a threat exactly. Worse than a threat. It sounded like advice from someone already inside the walls. By the time Marcus reached James Island, light rain had started falling across the marshes. His house sat at the end of a narrow private lane lined with old live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Nothing about the property looked flashy from the road. That was intentional. The exterior lights were warm and understated, the kind of place people underestimated unless they knew Charleston real estate well enough to understand what waterfront privacy actually cost. Marcus unlocked the front door and immediately noticed the kitchen lights were already on. Andre sat at the island scrolling through a tablet beside an untouched glass of bourbon. Thought you'd still be at the marina, Marcus said. Andre slid the tablet across the counter without answering right away. On the screen was a Charleston business blog Marcus had never seen before. Someone had already posted grainy cell phone photos of the Meridian Grace docked at Harbor Point Marina. One caption read, "Local logistics owner quietly joins Charleston luxury fleet circle." Another line underneath caught Marcus's attention immediately. Sources claim vessel linked to Ellington Maritime Holdings structure. Marcus stared at the word holdings. Not LLC. Not logistics. Holdings. Andre leaned back slowly. That information shouldn't be public yet. Marcus nodded once. The holding company existed for asset separation and maritime liability shielding. Only Evelyn Carter, Andre, and two senior accountants had access to the full structure. Even the marina contract only referenced a management subsidiary. Marcus picked up the tablet again and zoomed into one of the photos. In the reflection of the marina office glass stood two blurred figures near the registration desk. One was clearly the manager. The other wore a gray suit Marcus didn't recognize. Who posted this? Marcus asked quietly. Andre tapped the byline. Denise Whitmore. Marcus felt a small shift settle into place inside his chest. Denise and Tasha had been inseparable during the last 2 years of the marriage. Charity events. Real estate mixers. Brunches at places Marcus had always suspected they couldn't actually afford comfortably. Denise lived off proximity to wealth. More importantly, she collected information the way some people collected jewelry. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Marcus opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water. He didn't drink it immediately. His eyes stayed on the article. You think Tasha told her? Andre asked. Maybe. Marcus twisted the cap slowly. Or maybe somebody wanted her to. That possibility bothered him more. Tasha seeing the yacht by accident was believable. Social media exposure in Charleston happened fast. But someone connecting the vessel to the holding structure within an hour of registration meant information had moved through channels Marcus hadn't accounted for. Quietly. Efficiently. Deliberately. Andre studied him carefully. You think this goes beyond her? Marcus finally took a drink before answering. I think somebody started paying attention before tonight. The rain intensified outside, streaking the dark windows in silver lines. Somewhere deeper in the house, Marcus's security system chimed softly. Motion detected at the front gate. Andre stood immediately, but Marcus stayed calm. He walked toward the hallway monitor mounted beside the study entrance and pulled up the camera feed. Headlights glowed through rain near the property gate. Black SUV. Engine still running. Marcus zoomed in slightly. A man sat behind the wheel wearing a collared shirt, one hand resting against his jaw while looking toward the house. Not police. Not delivery. The vehicle remained there for 11 seconds before slowly pulling away back toward the road. Marcus memorized the license plate automatically. South Carolina commercial registration. Charleston County. Andre exhaled quietly. You know him? Marcus kept watching the empty gate camera after the SUV disappeared. No, then his eyes narrowed slightly at something else on the screen. Just before the SUV left, the driver had lifted a phone toward the windshield. Taking a photo. Not of the house. Of the security keypad mounted beside the gate. Marcus felt the shape of the situation changing again. This wasn't gossip anymore. Somebody was mapping access. Marcus replayed the security footage twice more after Andre left. The black SUV. The commercial plates. The phone lifted toward the keypad. None of it felt random anymore. By 1:14 a.m., rain still moved steadily across the windows overlooking the marsh, turning the dark glass into a shifting mirror while the security monitor cast pale blue light across his study. Marcus sat motionless behind his desk with a yellow legal pad open beside him. 3 names written down in clean block letters. Denise Whitmore. Tasha Ellington Reed. Unknown caller. He stared at the list for a long moment before adding a 4th. Julian Reed. The name unsettled him more than he expected. Not because he knew Julian personally. Because he remembered hearing it before the divorce. That realization came slowly. Like a photograph developing in chemicals. Marcus leaned back in his chair and let his memory move through old conversations, old charity events, old dinners where Tasha had spent more time discussing other people's houses than their own marriage. Julian Reed. Real estate developer. High-end waterfront projects. Marcus remembered one specific evening almost 4 years earlier at a rooftop fundraiser downtown. Tasha had laughed too hard at something Julian said while Marcus stood 2 feet away holding their drinks. At the time, Marcus had dismissed it as social climbing. Charleston was full of people orbiting money they hoped would eventually recognize them. But now another detail surfaced. On the drive home that night, Tasha had casually asked Marcus how business ownership protections worked after divorce. He remembered the exact intersection where she asked it because the question had felt strangely technical coming from nowhere. At the time, he thought she was talking about one of her real estate clients. Now he wasn't so sure. Marcus stood and crossed the study slowly. The house felt unusually silent after midnight. No television noise. No city traffic reaching this far out onto the island. Just rain against glass and the low electrical hum of recessed lighting. He unlocked the lower drawer of his desk and pulled out the old divorce binder Evelyn Carter had prepared 3 years earlier. The tabs were still perfectly organized. Property division. Financial disclosures. Tax allocations. Liability waivers. Marcus flipped through the pages carefully until he reached the mediation summary notes. His eyes stopped immediately on a handwritten annotation clipped near the back. Client expressed concern regarding future appreciation potential of business assets. Marcus stared at the sentence without moving. He hadn't written it. Evelyn hadn't either. The handwriting belonged to the mediator. Which meant Tasha herself had raised the issue during negotiations. Future appreciation potential. At the time, Ellington Maritime Logistics barely existed beyond a consulting operation and 2 leased transport contracts. Marcus had almost no visible assets then. So why had she been worried about future appreciation? A cold realization settled into place piece by piece. Tasha hadn't left believing Marcus would fail. She had left while quietly checking whether she could still benefit if he succeeded later. That changed something fundamental inside him. Not anger. Anger would have been easier. This felt worse. Structural. Like discovering cracks inside load-bearing concrete years after the building was finished. Marcus closed the binder slowly and reached for his phone. He opened Denise Whitmore's business blog again and studied the marina photos more carefully. This time he noticed something he missed earlier. In the reflection behind the registration desk stood the gray-suited man from the marina office. Only now Marcus could partially see the man's face turned toward the glass. Clean shave. Silver watch. Charleston Harbor Development Authority badge clipped near his belt. Marcus narrowed his eyes immediately. Harbor Authority officials didn't monitor private ownership transfers unless financing, liens, or regulatory reviews were involved. And none applied to the Meridian Grace. His phone buzzed suddenly against the desk. Text message. Unknown number again. This time there was no greeting. No explanation. Just a single image attachment. Marcus opened it slowly. The photo showed Tasha sitting inside a restaurant booth across from Julian Reed beneath low amber lighting. Nothing intimate. Nothing obvious. But sitting directly beside Julian on the table was a dark blue folder Marcus recognized instantly. Ellington Maritime Holdings. The older version of the logo. A version used only on internal structuring documents from nearly 2 years earlier. Marcus felt the room go very still around him. Because Tasha should never have had access to those files. And the moment he realized that, another realization followed immediately behind it, colder than the first. Someone had been collecting information about his companies long before the yacht ever entered the picture. Marcus did not sleep. By 5:42 a.m., the rain had stopped, leaving the marsh behind his house wrapped in pale gray fog while the security monitors still glowed softly across the study wall. The photograph of Tasha and Julian remained open on his desk beside the divorce binder, the older Ellington Maritime Holdings folder sitting between them like a misplaced piece from another life. Marcus stared at it for a long time before finally opening his laptop and pulling up the archived server logs for the company's internal document vault. Most people would not have known those records even existed. Marcus built the storage architecture himself 2 years earlier after a shipping client suffered a corporate breach. Every document access created a timestamp. Every download left a trail. Quiet systems. Invisible until someone disturbed them. The first irregularity appeared 17 months before the divorce finalized. A login request tied to an inactive employee credential. Access denied twice. Then granted remotely 6 minutes later through executive override permissions. Marcus narrowed his eyes immediately. He had only issued executive override authority to 2 people inside the company at the time, himself and Andre. Yet the log showed neither account initiated the approval. Instead, the authorization came through an administrative subkey connected to a temporary consulting profile. Marcus clicked deeper into the record. The IP trace routed through a downtown Charleston co-working office 3 blocks from one of Tasha's old real estate agencies. He sat back slowly. At the time, Ellington Maritime barely existed beyond consulting contracts and leased cargo coordination. There had been no reason for anyone outside the company to care about ownership structures then. Unless someone was already planning for what the company might become. Morning sunlight gradually pushed through the fog while Marcus drove downtown toward Evelyn Carter's office. Charleston's financial district moved quietly at that hour. Delivery trucks along narrow streets. Coffee shop lights flickering on beneath restored brick facades. Men in tailored suits walking into buildings older than most American states. Marcus parked beneath a private garage on Broad Street and entered through the side elevator reserved for tenants. Evelyn's law firm occupied the top 2 floors of a historic bank building renovated into dark wood offices and silent conference rooms. The receptionist greeted him immediately but paused when she saw his expression. "Ms. Carter's already waiting for you." Marcus noticed that too. He had not called ahead. Evelyn stood beside the conference room windows overlooking the harbor, reading printed documents through narrow-framed glasses. She did not waste time on greetings. "You're here because something changed last night," she said calmly. Marcus placed the photograph of Tasha and Julian on the table beside the Marina article and the server log printouts. Evelyn studied everything in complete silence. No visible reaction. But Marcus noticed her right thumb tap once lightly against the table after reading the access records. "This consulting credential," she asked quietly. "Who created it?" "Not me." "Andre?" "No," Evelyn nodded slowly like someone confirming a theory she already disliked. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up an old case archive Marcus had not seen since the divorce. "There's something I never pushed hard on during mediation because your instructions were clear. You wanted a clean separation. Fast. Quiet." She rotated the screen toward him. One page highlighted in yellow. "Request for delayed financial discovery rights tied to future business appreciation exposure." Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly for the first time all morning. Tasha had not only asked questions about future company value during mediation. Her attorney had formally attempted to preserve legal access to future growth. Why wasn't this pursued? Marcus asked evenly. Evelyn folded her hands. Because the request was withdrawn 48 hours later. Withdrawn by who? Her side. Marcus looked back at the document. Something about that bothered him immediately. If Tasha had truly believed he would never become successful, there would have been no reason to file the request in the first place. But if she believed future value mattered enough to protect legally, why abandon it 2 days later? Evelyn seemed to read the same question forming in his head. "People don't usually walk away from leverage voluntarily," she said quietly. Marcus's eyes moved toward the courthouse visible through the conference room glass across the street. Marble columns. Lawyers entering side doors. Systems layered inside systems. Then another detail surfaced suddenly in his memory. During the final week of the divorce, Tasha had stopped pressuring him for immediate asset disclosures almost overnight. At the time, he thought she had emotionally checked out of the marriage. Now he realized something colder. She may have stopped asking questions because someone else was already getting answers another way. Marcus left Evelyn Carter's office just after noon with the harbor sunlight reflecting hard off the courthouse windows across Broad Street. The city moved normally around him, tourists stepping into carriage rides, attorneys crossing intersections with leather briefcases, restaurant staff dragging outdoor tables into place for lunch service, but something fundamental had shifted in the way he was seeing people now. Not emotionally. Structurally. Every interaction suddenly carried the possibility of coordination underneath it. He walked through the underground garage toward his SUV while replaying Evelyn's words in precise order. People don't usually walk away from leverage voluntarily. That sentence stayed with him because it implied someone had convinced Tasha she no longer needed legal leverage through the divorce process. Which meant somebody believed they already had another path into his business. Inside the vehicle, Marcus opened the old server logs again on his phone while traffic crawled along Meeting Street. He filtered the access history by device authorization instead of employee name this time. 3 unauthorized retrieval attempts appeared across a 14-month period before the divorce finalized. Different credentials each time. Different routing points. But one repeating detail caught his attention immediately. Every access request occurred within 48 hours of Tasha attending a social event connected to Charleston development investors or maritime donors. Marcus zoomed in slowly on the timestamps. Harbor Charity Gala. Waterfront Restoration Dinner. Real Estate Association Fundraiser. The pattern was too clean to ignore now. Tasha may not have understood corporate structures herself, but someone around her had known exactly which information mattered. By late afternoon, Marcus parked outside a quiet waterfront restaurant near the Marina District where Andre had arranged to meet an old shipping compliance contact. The man's name was Leonard Pike, semi-retired, former regulatory consultant for Charleston Port Acquisitions. Marcus recognized him immediately through the restaurant window before even walking inside. Gray suit. Silver watch. Harbor Development Authority badge clipped near the belt. The same man reflected in Denise Whitmore's marina photo. Marcus slowed slightly near the entrance but did not react outwardly. Leonard stood when he saw him and extended a hand with practiced warmth. Marcus Ellington. Been hearing your name a lot lately. The sentence landed wrong immediately. Not congratulations. Observation. Marcus shook his hand calmly anyway and sat across from him beneath low-hanging lights and polished dark wood. André remained quiet beside him. Leonard stirred his coffee without drinking it. You made some fast moves these past few years, he said casually. People in Charleston notice growth like that. Marcus watched the man carefully. The language sounded conversational, but the cadence felt investigative. Depends which people, Marcus replied. Leonard smiled faintly at that. Then he asked a question that tightened something cold in Marcus's chest almost instantly. You still using Meridian Asset Group for offshore structuring? Marcus did not answer immediately. Because Meridian Asset Group had never once appeared in public filings connected to Ellington Maritime. The entity existed only as a dormant holding layer Evelyn created 18 months ago during a restructuring phase. Very few people even knew the name. André glanced toward Marcus for half a second before looking back down at the table. Leonard finally took a sip of coffee. Relax, he said lightly. Charleston's a small town in expensive shoes. But Marcus noticed something else then. Leonard's right hand rested beside a legal pad partially tucked beneath the table edge. And written near the top margin, upside down from Marcus's angle, was Julian Reed's name. The meeting ended 20 minutes later without direct confrontation, but Marcus walked out understanding far more than he had walking in. This was no longer about Tasha reconnecting emotionally after seeing his success. There were too many overlapping systems now. Regulatory contacts. Social circles. Financial language. Unauthorized document access. Quiet observation. Coordinated curiosity. Somebody had spent years tracking the possibility of his company becoming valuable long before it actually did. The realization followed him all the way back toward James Island while evening clouds rolled dark across the harbor again. Halfway home, his phone buzzed through the car speakers. Incoming call from Denise Whitmore. Marcus let it ring twice before answering. Denise's tone sounded overly warm the moment she spoke. Marcus, sweetheart, I heard you're doing very well these days. Marcus said nothing. Denise continued anyway. Tasha's been emotional lately. She feels like maybe certain things weren't fully transparent during the divorce. There it was. Not grief. Not regret. Transparency. Legal language again. Marcus stared through the windshield at the rain beginning to streak across the bridge ahead. Interesting choice of words, he said quietly. Denise laughed softly like the comment meant nothing. Then she made the mistake that changed everything. Well. Julian says there are ways to reopen old structures if hidden appreciation was anticipated before separation. Marcus felt the entire shape of the situation locked together in his mind at once. Because Denise should never have known that phrase. Hidden appreciation was terminology pulled almost word for word from the confidential mediation request Evelyn showed him only hours earlier. Which meant somebody beyond Tasha and Julian had access to sealed divorce strategy documents long before Marcus ever discovered the marina photo. Marcus ended the call with Denise without another word and kept driving through the rain toward James Island while Charleston blurred silver and gold beyond the windshield. Hidden appreciation. The phrase stayed in his head because it no longer sounded like legal curiosity. It sounded rehearsed. Structured. Someone had been feeding people fragments of confidential language for years. By the time he reached the private lane leading toward his property, Marcus no longer viewed the situation as an emotional aftermath of divorce. This was becoming something colder. Coordinated. He parked beneath the covered entrance and sat motionless inside the SUV for nearly a minute, listening to rain strike the roof while his phone screen glowed faintly in the dark cabin. Then he opened the archived billing records from Evelyn's firm. Most clients never reviewed attorney metadata carefully. Marcus did. Every invoice carried timestamps, document retrieval logs, consultation durations, courier requests. Quiet information hidden inside ordinary paperwork. He filtered the records to the final 90 days before the divorce finalized. 3 unusual entries surfaced almost immediately. External file retrieval authorization. Sealed document duplication request. Mediation archive access review. Marcus narrowed his eyes at the dates. All 3 requests occurred within days of Tasha attending social functions connected to Julian Reed's development group. More importantly, none of the requests had originated from Evelyn's office directly. They came through a third-party legal records vendor contracted by Charleston Family Court Administration. Marcus zoomed further into the authorization footer. One name appeared repeatedly beneath the requests. Leonard Pike. The realization settled slowly but completely. Leonard Pike wasn't just some retired regulatory consultant floating around Charleston social circles. He had access pathways into maritime filings, property structuring reviews, and apparently sealed mediation logistics through overlapping vendor relationships. Marcus walked into the house carrying that thought like extra weight across his shoulders. Inside, the lights remained low except for the kitchen where André sat reviewing spreadsheets beside an untouched bourbon glass. Marcus handed him the phone silently. André scanned the billing entries once, then again slower the second time. "That's not coincidence," he said quietly. Marcus moved toward the window overlooking the marsh. "No," André looked up from the screen. "You think Pike's working for Julian?" Marcus considered that carefully. "I think Julian's connected to people who've been watching investment structures longer than we realized." There was an important difference between those two things. André opened another file from his laptop and rotated it toward Marcus. "You need to see this too." It was a donor board from a Charleston Waterfront Preservation Foundation. At first glance it looked harmless. Wealthy names. Corporate sponsors. Real estate families. Shipping interests. But then Marcus recognized the overlap. Julian Reed sat on the advisory board. Denise Whitmore handled donor outreach events. Leonard Pike served as infrastructure compliance liaison. And listed beneath maritime development contributors was Meridian Asset Group. Marcus stared at the screen without moving. Meridian had never publicly sponsored anything in Charleston. The entity barely existed on paper outside layered holding structures Evelyn created years earlier. Yet somehow it appeared tied into a foundation network connecting all 3 names. Marcus felt the shape of the system widening around him. Not random leaks. Not gossip. Social positioning. Legal access. Financial observation. Quiet surveillance hidden behind charity boards and development circles. Charleston suddenly looked different in his mind than it ever had before. Less like a city and more like overlapping networks of people protecting information for each other. André broke the silence carefully. How would they even know Meridian existed? Marcus answered immediately this time. Somebody saw internal filings before the restructuring completed. The sentence hung heavily in the room because both men understood what it implied. Access that deep would have required either direct document exposure or someone inside a professional chain, legal, accounting, regulatory, feeding information outward. Rain continued sliding against the windows while Marcus reopened the photograph of Tasha and Julian inside the restaurant booth. This time he noticed something else hidden near the edge of the frame. A reflection in the dark glass behind them. Another person seated farther back in the private dining room. Older man. Gray suit. Silver watch. Leonard Pike again. Marcus's eyes hardened slightly as the final pattern locked into place. Tasha hadn't simply reappeared after seeing his yacht. She had been moving inside a connected social and legal ecosystem for years without Marcus understanding the real purpose of it. And the most unsettling realization came last. The photograph had not been sent to him as a threat. It had been sent as a message. Someone inside that network wanted Marcus to know he was finally starting to see the board they'd been playing on the entire time. Marcus did not contact Tasha the next morning. That decision mattered more than anger would have. By now, he understood something essential about the people moving around this situation: they were expecting emotion. Defensive explanations. Rash reactions. Maybe even fear. Instead, Marcus went to work exactly on schedule. At 7:10 a.m., he walked through the glass entrance of Ellington Maritime Logistics wearing the same charcoal jacket he'd worn for years, coffee in one hand, calm expression unchanged. Employees nodded respectfully as he crossed the operations floor overlooking Charleston Harbor. Cargo schedules moved across digital monitors. Dispatch coordinators handled shipping calls. Forklifts crawled through loading lanes outside. Normal morning. Marcus let everyone believe it was still a normal week. Quietly, that gave him room to think. From the second-floor office windows, he watched a black SUV idle briefly across the street near the employee parking entrance before pulling away again. Different vehicle than the one at his house. Same tinted windows. Same deliberate pacing. Marcus memorized the plate automatically but showed no reaction outwardly. Andre entered his office carrying a tablet and closed the door behind him. "You were right," he said quietly. Meridian Asset Group has been appearing inside Charleston donor filings for almost 2 years. Marcus looked up immediately. "How?" Andre rotated the screen toward him. A chain of shell contributions linked through preservation foundations, maritime redevelopment grants, and infrastructure sponsorships. Small amounts. Carefully layered. Just enough to create paper visibility without attracting scrutiny. The implication landed heavily. Somebody had been slowly normalizing Meridian's presence inside Charleston financial networks long before Marcus publicly expanded the company. Marcus leaned back in silence while sunlight reflected off cargo cranes outside the harbor windows. "That's not accidental visibility," he said finally. Andre nodded. "It's positioning." "Exactly." Someone had been building familiarity around entities connected to Marcus's future holdings before those holdings became valuable enough to defend aggressively. Charleston's elite circles worked on recognition and comfort. The more often a name appeared quietly around donors, boards, and redevelopment projects, the easier it became later to frame access, partnership, or entitlement as normal. Marcus suddenly understood why Denise Whitmore's blog article had been written the way it was. Not scandal. Integration. The narrative wasn't trying to destroy him publicly. It was trying to socially reposition his success as something already connected to existing Charleston networks. Around noon, Marcus drove alone to a private records office near the county courthouse where Maritime Incorporation archives were stored. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of quiet government-adjacent place most people ignored completely. He requested historical filing access under one of Ellington Maritime's dormant acquisition entities and sat alone at a viewing terminal while fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Most of the records looked normal until he reached a filing amendment submitted 21 months earlier. Marcus stared at the authorization page without moving. An information inquiry request regarding projected ownership restructuring had been filed under an outside advisory review panel. Reviewing consultant, Pike Regulatory Strategies. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Leonard Pike had not stumbled into his business recently. Leonard Pike had been examining restructuring pathways tied to Marcus's companies before the divorce even finalized. The realization changed the emotional temperature of everything. Tasha's questions during mediation. Denise's legal phrasing. The marina monitoring. Meridian appearing inside donor systems. Leonard Pike sitting quietly inside private restaurants discussing ownership structures with Julian Reed. This wasn't random opportunism after seeing a yacht. It looked increasingly like a long-game financial observation network built around anticipating future value. Marcus closed the archive window slowly just as his phone vibrated across the desk. Evelyn Carter. "You need to come by the office," she said immediately. Her tone was flatter than usual. Controlled. "Something was delivered this morning." 30 minutes later Marcus stood inside her conference room beneath low recessed lighting while rain clouds gathered darkly over the harbor again. A sealed envelope rested on the table between them. No return address. No courier information. Evelyn slid a pair of gloves toward him first before speaking again. "Open it carefully." Inside was a single photocopied document. Marcus recognized it instantly. His original post-divorce restructuring roadmap. Internal. Confidential. Never publicly filed. Certain sections highlighted in yellow marker. One sentence circled heavily near the bottom: full asset consolidation scheduled after final separation exposure window expires. Marcus felt something cold settle fully into place inside him then. Because only 3 people had ever seen that roadmap in its complete form. Himself. Andre. And the accountant who died unexpectedly 11 months after the divorce. Marcus did not react visibly when he saw the photocopied restructuring roadmap on Evelyn Carter's conference table. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed. Most people would have gone straight to anger. Demands. Panic. Marcus simply sat down slowly beneath the low amber lights of the boardroom and studied the highlighted sentence again while rain pressed softly against the dark harbor windows behind him. Full asset consolidation scheduled after final separation exposure window expires. The wording sounded clinical now, but Marcus remembered exactly when he wrote it. 2 months after the divorce. During a restructuring phase designed specifically to keep future holdings insulated from personal litigation exposure. Very few people even understood what the sentence meant. Which meant whoever sent this document wasn't bluffing anymore. They were signaling access. Evelyn folded her hands carefully across the table. The original hard copy disappeared from our archive 11 months ago. Marcus looked up immediately. "You never mentioned that." "Because at the time, we assumed it was internal misfiling." Evelyn's voice remained controlled, but Marcus noticed a faint tension around her jaw that rarely appeared. "After your accountant died unexpectedly, we conducted a quiet internal review. Nothing else appeared compromised." Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair. That sentence mattered. Nothing else appeared compromised. Not confirmed. Not proven. Appeared. There was a difference. His accountant, Harold Vane, had handled early restructuring pathways tied to Meridian Asset Group before the offshore consolidation layers finalized. Harold also understood exactly why Marcus built the company the way he did after the divorce: slow visibility, layered ownership, no obvious pressure points. Marcus suddenly realized something unsettling. Whoever had access to Harold's records may have understood his future financial architecture years before the public ever saw success. The room fell quiet for several seconds except for distant thunder over the harbor. Then Marcus asked the question that changed the direction of the conversation completely. Who inherited Harold's files after he died? Evelyn looked at him carefully. Technically, the accounting firm absorbed client administration. Not technically. Marcus's tone remained calm. Operationally. Evelyn hesitated once. Tiny pause. But Marcus noticed it immediately. A transition consultant handled temporary records integration before the merger finalized. Marcus waited. Evelyn finally exhaled softly. Pike Regulatory Strategies was subcontracted during that period. There it was. Not coincidence anymore. Not social overlap. Leonard Pike had touched the mediation structures, the donor systems, the regulatory channels, and now potentially the accounting transition itself. Marcus felt the entire architecture behind the situation becoming clearer with every layer. Somebody had spent years quietly positioning themselves around the edges of his future wealth before it fully existed. Marcus stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Charleston Harbor. Cargo ships moved slowly through the rain-dark water beyond the glass while courthouse lights glowed downtown beneath gathering storm clouds. "They still think I don't see the whole board," he said quietly. Evelyn studied him carefully. "Do you?" Marcus did not answer directly. Instead, he reached into his jacket and removed a thin black access card, placing it gently on the conference table. Evelyn's eyes narrowed almost immediately when she recognized the logo. Meridian International Trust. Not Meridian Asset Group. Different entity entirely. One that had never appeared in any Charleston filings, donor systems, or restructuring maps. Evelyn looked back up at him slowly. "You never disclosed this structure." "Because nobody ever asked the right questions." Marcus's tone stayed level, almost detached. "Everyone's been focused on ownership visibility. They never stopped to consider custody control." Evelyn said nothing after that because she understood exactly what he meant. The visible companies were not necessarily the real center of power. Marcus finally turned back toward the table. "I want every inquiry request, donor overlap, and regulatory access tied to Pike mapped chronologically." Evelyn nodded once. Quietly. Very quietly. Marcus picked up the photocopied roadmap again, but this time his eyes settled on something he had overlooked earlier. A faint notation stamped near the lower corner. Archive reference copy beat 19. His expression changed slightly for the first time all evening. Because Marcus knew exactly what beat 19 referred to. Not a legal archive. A storage classification. Harold Vane had maintained private backup files in a secure records facility outside Charleston under coded vault references. Marcus looked at Evelyn slowly. "This copy didn't come from your office." "Then where did it come from?" Marcus slid the document back into the envelope carefully while thunder rolled across the harbor outside. "Somebody accessed Harold's external archive after his death." And the moment he said it aloud, Marcus realized something even colder underneath it. If Pike's network had reached those vault records, then somewhere inside that facility existed far more than old restructuring drafts. There were sealed financial projections, dormant trust pathways, and the one document Marcus never intended anyone outside Harold and himself to ever see. Marcus drove to Savannah 2 days later without telling anyone except Evelyn Carter. Not Andre. Not his executive team. Certainly not Tasha. The black Mercedes moved quietly through coastal rain before sunrise while sealed folders rested in the passenger seat beside him. Harold Vane's external archive facility sat outside the city limits inside a converted records warehouse used mostly by old law firms, estate managers, and private financial custodians who preferred discretion over modern cloud systems. Marcus had not visited the facility in almost 3 years. At the time, he believed Harold's death closed that chapter permanently. Now every mile toward the building felt less like retrieval and more like confirmation. Because if someone inside Pike's network had reached those vault records already, then this was no longer simply about money after divorce. It was about access to future power. The warehouse interior smelled faintly of dust, climate control, and old paper sealed behind decades of legal silence. A gray-haired records supervisor led Marcus through secured corridors lined with numbered vault cages while fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. "Mr. Vane maintained private retention status on several of your files," the man explained carefully. Very unusual setup. Marcus noticed the wording immediately. Maintained. Past tense. Has anyone accessed Vault Beat 19 since Harold died? The supervisor hesitated just slightly before answering. One authorized review request was processed 8 months ago. Marcus stopped walking. Authorized by who? The man checked a tablet uneasily. Court-adjacent compliance verification. Marcus said nothing after that because the phrase matched the exact type of layered legal language Pike's network seemed to prefer. Official enough to gain cooperation. Vague enough to avoid scrutiny. Inside the secured viewing room, Marcus finally opened Vault B-19 personally for the first time since Harold's funeral. Rows of sealed binders sat untouched beneath dim overhead lighting. Financial projections. Trust structures. Maritime acquisition maps. Everything appeared intact at first glance until Marcus noticed one missing section immediately. Folder B-19, Delta. Removed. His expression did not change outwardly, but something cold settled deeper inside him. Delta contained the one restructuring pathway Harold advised Marcus never to digitize. Not because it was illegal. Because it was invisible. The folder detailed dormant acquisition rights connected to a coastal infrastructure consortium that would eventually become worth tens of millions if Charleston's harbor expansion completed on schedule. Very few people even knew Marcus quietly controlled future options tied to that consortium. Fewer still understood how much leverage it could eventually create. Marcus sat alone beneath the low lights reviewing the remaining files carefully while rain rattled faintly against the warehouse windows. Then another realization emerged from the timeline itself. The unauthorized review request 8 months earlier happened before the Meridian Grace existed. Before Ellington Maritime publicly expanded. Before Charleston business journals even considered Marcus important enough to mention. Which meant Pike's network had not been reacting to visible wealth. They had been tracking projected future ownership long before success became public. The entire narrative around Tasha returning after the yacht suddenly looked smaller than the truth underneath it. Marcus understood now that he had spent years being quietly evaluated by people who believed he didn't fully understand the value of what he was building. By evening, Marcus returned to Charleston and drove directly to a waterfront charity gala hosted inside the historic Avery Exchange Hall downtown. He had not originally planned to attend, but after reviewing the vault records, the event suddenly mattered differently. The ballroom glowed gold beneath crystal chandeliers while Charleston's development elite moved between marble columns holding champagne and discussing coastal investments. Marcus entered quietly in a dark tailored suit, saying little, observing everything. Across the room, he spotted Denise Whitmore laughing beside Julian Reed near the donor display wall. And then he noticed something else. Tasha standing with them. Her expression shifted the moment she saw him walk in. Not guilt. Surprise. Like someone who expected him to still be confused. Marcus moved calmly through the crowd while conversation subtly changed around him. He could feel it now, the social architecture underneath Charleston's polished surface. The donor boards. The redevelopment alliances. The legal intermediaries. The carefully rehearsed narratives. Julian finally approached first with an easy smile and expensive confidence. Marcus, he said warmly, extending a hand. Heard business is booming. Marcus shook his hand once. Firm. Controlled. Julian leaned slightly closer afterward, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal. Funny thing about old marriages, he said casually. Sometimes value gets created long before people realize it. There it was again. Legal framing disguised as conversation. Marcus looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. Sometimes people mistake observation for ownership. Julian's smile tightened almost invisibly. Tiny reaction. But Marcus caught it. Then Marcus noticed the final detail that changed everything. Mounted beside the donor wall was a framed list of founding infrastructure partners connected to Charleston Harbor Redevelopment Phase 2. Near the bottom sat a familiar name in silver lettering. Meridian International Trust. Not Asset Group. Not any public-facing entity. The real trust. Marcus felt the room shift around him instantly. Because he had never publicly linked Meridian International Trust to Charleston Infrastructure Holdings. Not once. Which meant one of two things had happened. Either someone inside Harold's missing Delta files had begun quietly positioning the trust within Charleston's redevelopment ecosystem years ago. Or someone with access to those files had already started using Marcus's hidden structures without his knowledge. Marcus left the gala without speaking to Tasha again, but he noticed her watching him through the ballroom crowd as he walked past the donor displays and crystal-lit conversations. Not with anger. With uncertainty. For the first time since this began, she no longer looked fully confident he was still behind the situation. That mattered. Outside, Charleston shimmered beneath wet pavement and harbor fog while black SUVs lined the curb outside Avery Exchange Hall. Marcus paused briefly under the covered entrance and glanced once more through the ballroom windows. Julian Reed was already speaking quietly with Leonard Pike near the redevelopment display wall, both men leaning inward with the focused body language of people recalculating something. Marcus stepped into his Mercedes without reacting outwardly, but internally the entire structure was becoming clearer now. The pressure around him wasn't improvisation anymore. It was acceleration. The next morning began with 3 separate developments before 9 a.m. First, Evelyn Carter received formal notice that Tasha intended to reopen portions of the divorce settlement under concealed future valuation exposure review. Second, a Charleston business columnist published an article questioning whether Ellington Maritime's expansion had benefited from undisclosed pre-divorce strategic positioning. Third, Marcus discovered 2 institutional banking inquiries submitted overnight against dormant acquisition entities connected to Meridian International Trust. Different systems. Same timing. Marcus sat quietly inside his office overlooking the harbor while cargo cranes moved against gray morning skies outside the glass. Coordinated pressure. Legal. Social. Financial. Somebody wanted multiple systems tightening simultaneously. Andre entered carrying printed copies of the legal filing. "They're moving faster now," he said carefully. Marcus read the paperwork without visible emotion. Tasha's attorneys framed everything exactly the way Denise and Julian had been speaking for weeks: anticipated appreciation, concealed structuring, deferred ownership visibility. Language designed less to win immediately and more to create discovery access into hidden holdings. Marcus understood the strategy instantly. They did not necessarily need to prove Tasha owned part of his empire. They only needed enough procedural leverage to force exposure of structures nobody outside a very small circle was supposed to see. Andre watched him closely. "You think Pike wrote this?" Marcus closed the file calmly. "No, then who?" Marcus's eyes drifted toward the harbor. "Someone who thinks they already know what they're looking for." Around noon, Marcus drove downtown for a scheduled meeting at a private banking office overlooking Charleston Harbor. The elevator ride-up felt unnaturally quiet, broken only by soft jazz and the muted glow of city lights through smoked glass panels. Inside the conference suite, 2 senior advisors waited beside untouched bourbon glasses and neatly stacked folders. Their expressions were professionally controlled, but Marcus noticed the shift immediately. Respect mixed with caution. One advisor finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Ellington, because of the recent legal inquiries surrounding Meridian-linked entities, certain custodial reviews may be triggered automatically." Custodial reviews. Another carefully chosen phrase. Marcus leaned back slightly in the leather chair. "And if those reviews happen?" The older advisor hesitated. It could attract attention from parties who were previously unaware certain holdings existed. Marcus understood the implication beneath the language immediately. The hidden structures protecting the real center of his wealth were getting close enough to visibility that outside actors could begin mapping them. But what the advisors did not know was that Marcus had already moved part of the board days earlier. Quietly. Without public filings. Without Charleston visibility. He opened a thin black folder from his briefcase and slid a single authorization form across the table. Both advisors looked down at it simultaneously, and their expressions changed almost instantly. One of them actually sat back in silence for a moment before speaking again. "You already initiated transfer authority?" Marcus nodded once. Calm. Controlled. 48 hours ago. Neither advisor asked why because the answer was obvious now. Marcus had seen the pressure wave building before the legal filings arrived. The older advisor lowered his voice carefully. Then most of the exposed structures they're targeting are no longer central, Marcus finished quietly. The room fell silent after that. By evening, rain hammered Charleston again while Marcus stood alone inside his office watching headlights crawl across the bridge toward downtown. His phone buzzed once against the desk. Tasha. First direct message in days. He opened it slowly. We need to talk before this gets uglier. Marcus read the sentence twice. Not because of the words themselves. Because of the timing. Tasha had never asked to talk while she believed she was winning. Somewhere inside the growing pressure campaign around him, cracks were beginning to form already. Before he could respond, another message arrived immediately afterward. Not from Tasha. Unknown number again. This time the sender included only an address and a time. Charleston Harbor Redevelopment Board, Executive Session, 8 p.m. tomorrow. Marcus stared at the glowing screen while thunder rolled outside the office windows. Because executive sessions were closed-door meetings attended only by senior infrastructure stakeholders, legal advisors, and controlling financial interests. And Marcus had never publicly been listed as one of them. Yet somehow, someone expected him to be in that room tomorrow night when the real conversation finally began. The executive session took place on the 42nd floor of Charleston Harbor Redevelopment Tower, behind smoked glass doors guarded by private security and silent reception staff who spoke in lowered voices. Marcus arrived exactly 3 minutes before 8 wearing a dark charcoal suit and carrying only a slim leather folder beneath his arm. Rain moved across the city outside the massive windows overlooking the harbor while black SUVs lined the private entrance below. The moment Marcus stepped into the boardroom, conversation shifted almost imperceptibly. Not stopped. Shifted. He recognized nearly everyone seated around the long walnut conference table now. Leonard Pike near the center beside redevelopment attorneys. Julian Reed farther down with 2 financial consultants. Denise Whitmore near the back pretending she belonged there. And Tasha sitting silently beside outside counsel, her expression tighter than he had ever seen it. For the first time since the divorce, she looked uncertain about who exactly she had aligned herself with. No one greeted Marcus immediately. That alone told him the room had expected resistance, not attendance. A silver-haired attorney finally cleared his throat and gestured toward the empty chair halfway down the table. Mr. Ellington. Thank you for joining us. Marcus sat calmly without asking why he had been invited. Because by now he already understood the real purpose of the meeting. They weren't trying to accuse him publicly. They were trying to pressure controlled disclosure through coordinated legal optics before harbor expansion contracts finalized next quarter. Pike opened first, speaking in the measured tone of someone used to rooms where money hid behind formal language. Questions have emerged regarding overlapping interests connected to Meridian entities and future infrastructure appreciation. Marcus noticed several people watching him carefully after that statement. Waiting for discomfort. Panic. Denial. Instead, he folded his hands quietly on the table. Which Meridian entity, he asked. The question landed harder than Pike expected. Tiny pause. Barely visible. But Marcus saw it immediately. Because Pike had assumed Marcus would answer defensively instead of forcing precision. Meridian Asset Group, Pike replied finally. Marcus nodded once. That entity holds no controlling infrastructure position. Another silence spread through the room then. Short. Dangerous. Julian leaned forward slightly. Then perhaps you'd clarify which entity does. There it was. Not investigation anymore. Fishing. Strategic fishing disguised as oversight. Marcus looked toward the rain-dark harbor beyond the windows before answering calmly. Interesting question coming from someone who already filed inquiries into structures he claims not to understand. Julian's expression shifted almost invisibly. Across the table, Tasha looked toward him sharply for the first time that evening. Evelyn Carter entered the room 30 seconds later carrying another leather portfolio and placed it quietly beside Marcus before taking the remaining seat near the end of the table. Several attorneys recognized her immediately. The atmosphere changed again after that. More cautious now. Pike attempted to regain control. Mr. Ellington, if hidden appreciation structures existed before your divorce finalized, there may be legal exposure regarding undeclared future valuation pathways. Marcus finally opened the portfolio in front of him. Not rushed. Not emotional. Just deliberate. You keep using that phrase, he said quietly. Future valuation pathways. He slid a single document across the table toward Pike. So let's discuss where it actually came from. Pike's confidence cracked for the first time the moment he saw the page. Internal Records Request Authorization. Pike Regulatory Strategies. Timestamped 14 months before Marcus's divorce finalized. Attached beneath it was another page, Unauthorized Archive Inquiry Approval tied to Harold Vane's external vault access. Nobody spoke immediately after that. Rain hammered softly against the windows while city lights shimmered across the harbor below. Marcus watched the room carefully now. Denise looked confused. Julian looked irritated. But Tasha looked something worse. Lost. Like pieces of the situation were no longer matching the version she had been told. Pike recovered first. These documents prove nothing illegal. Marcus nodded slightly. Correct. But they prove strategic interest existed years before any public wealth event occurred. Evelyn finally spoke then, her voice calm and sharp enough to cut through the room without rising. Which creates a significant problem for anyone attempting to argue spontaneous post-divorce discovery concerns. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Heavy. Because the room understood exactly what had just happened. The narrative had shifted publicly for the first time. Marcus was no longer the ex-husband defending hidden wealth. Pike's network was suddenly defending why they had monitored projected future ownership structures years in advance. Julian leaned back slowly, studying Marcus differently now. Not like a man being cornered. Like a man reassessing an opponent he had underestimated for too long. You planned for this, he said quietly. Marcus met his eyes evenly. No, he replied. I planned for people eventually showing me who they were. Tasha looked down at the table after that. Marcus noticed her hands trembling slightly near the legal folders. Small detail. But important. Because she was finally beginning to understand something the others still didn't fully grasp yet. Marcus had not spent the last few years simply building money. He had spent those years building layers. Legal layers. Ownership layers. Visibility layers. And now the people who believed they understood his structures were slowly realizing they had only been looking at the outer shell. Then the final blow of the evening arrived quietly. One of the redevelopment attorneys near the end of the table opened an email notification on his tablet and suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes moved quickly across the screen before lifting toward Marcus with visible confusion. This can't be right, he murmured. Pike frowned immediately. What? The attorney swallowed once. Meridian International Trust just filed controlling custodial authority over Harbor Phase 2 acquisition rights. The room went completely silent. Even Julian looked stunned now. Because everyone at that table understood what the filing meant instantly. Whoever controlled those acquisition rights controlled the future infrastructure expansion they had all been circling for years. And until that exact moment, none of them realized Marcus had already positioned himself at the center of it. The silence inside the executive boardroom lasted long enough for Marcus to hear rain striking the glass 42 floors above Charleston Harbor. Nobody moved immediately after the filing notification appeared on the attorney's tablet. Pike stared at the screen first with irritation, then with something colder beneath it. Confusion. Real confusion. Julian leaned forward and demanded to see the filing himself while two redevelopment lawyers began quietly checking their phones almost at the same time. Marcus stayed seated with both hands calmly folded in front of him, watching the room reorganize itself around a truth none of them had expected. Meridian International Trust did not merely hold indirect exposure anymore. It held controlling custodial authority. The center of gravity had shifted while everyone else was still circling the outer structure. Tasha looked toward Marcus slowly, like she was seeing a stranger replace someone she thought she understood. "You already moved everything," she said softly. "Not accusation. Realization." Marcus met her eyes but did not answer immediately. Across the room, Pike finally regained enough composure to speak. "This filing timing is highly irregular." Evelyn Carter responded before Marcus could. "No," she said calmly. "What's irregular is outside parties attempting to force discovery into structures they were never legally entitled to access in the first place." The sentence landed hard. One of the redevelopment attorneys removed his glasses and leaned back silently while another began reviewing older inquiry records tied to Pike regulatory strategies. Marcus noticed it immediately. The room's trust was shifting away from Pike now. Quietly. Publicly. And Pike knew it. Julian tried next. "You think one filing changes ownership exposure?" His tone carried less confidence than before. Marcus finally spoke. "No. But it changes who controls the gate." Julian's jaw tightened slightly. Tiny reaction. But Marcus saw Tasha notice it too. That mattered. Because for the first time, she was beginning to understand she had not been standing beside people in control. She had been standing beside people chasing control they never fully had. The realization spread visibly across the room in subtle ways. Denise stopped speaking entirely. Two advisors moved their chairs farther from Pike's side of the table without seeming to realize they were doing it. Even the security staff near the entrance looked different now, less protective of the room's power structure and more observant of who was actually holding authority. Then the next collapse arrived faster than anyone expected. One of the financial consultants opened a fresh message on his tablet and visibly froze before sliding it toward Julian. Marcus watched Julian's expression drain slowly as he read. Harbor Phase 2's preliminary financing review had just been suspended pending custodial clarification linked to unauthorized inquiry activity. Suspended. Not denied. Worse. Frozen. Every development group attached to the project suddenly faced delays, scrutiny, and internal review. Marcus understood immediately what the others were realizing in real time. Once the trust filing became central, every earlier attempt to probe hidden structures now looked dangerously self-serving. Pike stood abruptly. "This is procedural manipulation." Evelyn remained seated. "No," she replied quietly. "This is what happens when people confuse observation with entitlement." Tasha lowered her eyes after that. Marcus noticed her breathing becoming uneven beside the legal folders spread across the table. She looked smaller now somehow. Not physically. Socially. The confidence she carried into the room had depended on a shared assumption, that Marcus was simply a successful ex-husband hiding money. But that version of him no longer existed in anyone's mind at the table. Now they were looking at someone who had quietly built layered custodial systems, controlled future infrastructure leverage, anticipated exposure attempts before they arrived, and repositioned critical authority before legal pressure even started. Marcus watched Tasha process that in silence. The worst part for her was not the money. It was the delayed recognition. Realizing too late that the calm man she once dismissed as not ambitious enough had been thinking several moves ahead of everyone around him for years. Pike attempted one final recovery. "This isn't over," he said sharply. Marcus looked at him evenly. "I know." The answer unsettled the room more than anger would have. Because Marcus did not sound defensive. He sounded prepared. One of the redevelopment attorneys finally closed his folder and stood. Given the new custodial position, he said carefully, all inquiry actions tied to Ellington-related structures will need immediate review. Translation. The investigation had reversed direction. Pike understood it instantly. So did Julian. The pressure system they built around Marcus was now beginning to fold back onto itself through the exact legal and financial channels they tried to weaponize against him. By the time the meeting ended, rain had stopped outside and Charleston's harbor lights shimmered across wet streets below the tower. People exited the boardroom differently than they entered it. Quieter. Faster. Avoiding eye contact. Denise disappeared almost immediately. Julian walked out while aggressively whispering into his phone. Pike remained behind arguing with counsel near the windows. But Tasha stayed seated after everyone else began leaving. Marcus gathered his folder calmly and turned toward the door until her voice stopped him. Marcus. He looked back once. Her eyes were red now, though she was trying hard to hide it. How long have you known they were using me? The question hung heavily in the emptying room because Marcus understood something she still hadn't fully accepted yet. She was only now beginning to realize the people she trusted never saw her as a partner either. Just access. Marcus studied her quietly for a moment before answering. Long enough to know you never asked why they cared so much about what belonged to me. Then he walked toward the elevator while security quietly closed the boardroom doors behind him. But just before the elevator reached the lobby, Evelyn's phone buzzed beside him. She read the message once and looked up slowly. Pike's legal protections are collapsing faster than expected, she said quietly. Marcus noticed something else in her expression too. Concern. There's more, she added. Federal Financial Review just opened on every redevelopment inquiry connected to Harbor Phase 2. Marcus stared ahead at the descending floor numbers in silence while Charleston's lights reflected faintly across the mirrored elevator walls. Because that meant the collapse had moved beyond divorce, beyond social humiliation, beyond Charleston politics entirely. The system behind Pike was starting to break open at a level none of them could control anymore. 3 weeks later, Charleston moved on the way wealthy cities always did. Quietly. Efficiently. Newspaper language softened from scandal to restructuring review. Harbor Phase 2 entered federal oversight. Pike regulatory strategies dissolved under multiple inquiry requests tied to unauthorized access activity and disclosure violations. Julian Reed's development financing collapsed almost overnight once lenders realized the infrastructure leverage he promised investors had never truly belonged to him. Marcus followed none of it publicly. He stopped attending donor events. Stopped answering speculative business calls. Stopped caring what Charleston's social circles whispered over expensive dinners and waterfront cocktails. The city that once looked at him like a quiet logistics operator now spoke his name carefully, like people suddenly aware they had misunderstood the scale of the man they'd been watching for years. Marcus stood inside his office before sunrise one Friday morning overlooking the harbor while cargo ships moved slowly through pale blue fog beyond the glass. The building was silent except for distant dock activity below. On his desk sat the final legal closure packet from Evelyn Carter's firm. Tasha's petition had been fully withdrawn. All discovery actions terminated. Formal statement submitted. No ownership exposure. No entitlement claim. No future review pathway. Marcus signed the final page calmly and slid the folder aside without ceremony. The victory did not feel loud to him. It felt clean. Like a door finally shutting after years of invisible pressure pressing against it. His phone buzzed softly a moment later. Evelyn. It's done, she said simply. Marcus looked out toward the harbor again. I know. The strangest part was how little satisfaction he felt toward the people who tried to corner him. Not because they hadn't damaged parts of his life. They had. But somewhere during the collapse, Marcus stopped seeing them as enemies and started seeing them as people trapped inside their own hunger. Pike mistook access for ownership. Julian mistook confidence for control. Denise mistook proximity to wealth for power. And Tasha. Tasha mistook quietness for limitation. That was the one that stayed with him the longest. Not because he still wanted her back. He didn't. But because he remembered the version of himself she stopped believing in before the world ever gave him visible proof. Later that afternoon, Marcus drove alone to the marina where the Meridian Grace rested quietly against the dock beneath clear skies for the first time in weeks. Rain had finally passed. Harbor water shimmered gold beneath the late afternoon sun while gulls drifted above the coastline. Marcus stepped onto the yacht slowly, loosening his jacket as the wind moved across the deck. The marina staff treated him differently now. More respectful. More careful. But Marcus noticed something else too. Nobody watched him with suspicion anymore. The whispers had changed into distance. Recognition carried its own kind of silence. Andre was already on board reviewing shipping manifests when Marcus arrived. "You ever think it'd end like this?" he asked. Marcus glanced toward the city skyline across the harbor. "No," he answered honestly. "I thought it would end louder." Andre smiled faintly at that. "Guess that's the difference between you and everybody else." As evening settled across Charleston, Marcus received one final message from Tasha. No legal language this time. No manipulation. No strategic phrasing carefully borrowed from other people. Just one sentence. "I really didn't know who you were." Marcus stared at the message for several seconds before locking the screen again. The words should have felt victorious somehow. Instead, they felt sad. Because the truth was simpler than she realized. Marcus had always been this person. Careful. Patient. Quietly ambitious. She just stopped looking before his life reached the part where the world finally noticed too. He deleted the message afterward without replying. Night settled slowly over the harbor while the yacht drifted gently against its moorings. Marcus walked alone to the upper deck carrying a glass of bourbon he never actually drank. Below him, Charleston glowed warm against the dark coastline, old money, new power, shattered reputations, quiet recoveries. The city would keep moving. The investigations would continue without him. People would rebuild alliances. Rewrite stories. Pretend they always understood what happened. But Marcus no longer needed anything from any of them. Not recognition. Not validation. Not apology. The wind moved softly across the water as he rested one hand against the polished railing and looked out toward the open Atlantic beyond the harbor lights. For years, people underestimated him because he never fought for attention. They assumed silence meant weakness. Simplicity. Smallness. What they never understood was that Marcus Ellington had been building his life the same way he built everything else, quietly beneath the surface, layer by layer, until the structure became too powerful to ignore. And somewhere back in the city behind him, the people who once tried to claim a share of his future now had to live with something far heavier than losing money. They had to live with realizing they walked away from the one man in the room who never needed to announce his power for it to be real. If you made it all the way to the end, let me know your thoughts on Marcus and Tasha's story, and subscribe if you enjoy cinematic stories about hidden power, betrayal, and quiet reversals like this one.